The story of the 20th century is a tapestry woven with the threads of progress and discovery. But at its very center lies a dark and jagged tear, caused by the life of a single man who rose from the absolute depths of obscurity to become the personification of human evil. We begin our exploration not with a dictator on the podium, but with the shadow he cast before he ever spoke a word to the masses. A shadow that began in the heart of a crumbling empire, where the old world of kings and emperors was beginning to rot from within. Adolf Hitler was not a monster who appeared from a vacuum, but was the product of a specific time and a specific place where ancient prejudices met modern frustrations to create a lethal cocktail of ideological fanatical resolve. He was a man who felt the sting of every personal failure as a national insult, a man who viewed his own lack of talent as a conspiracy of the world against his genius, and a man who learned to speak the secret language of a wounded nation's soul over the next 25 chapters. We will trace the path of this black sun from the quiet border towns of Austria to the blood-soaked trenches of the Great War, and finally to the scorched earth of a continent in flames. We will examine how a failed artist learned to paint with the blood of millions, how a lonely vagabond transformed himself into a godlike figure for a desperate people, and how the machinery of a modern state was hijacked to serve the most primitive instincts of tribalism and hate. This is a journey into the mechanics of radicalization, a study of how thin the veneer of civilization truly is, and how easily it can be stripped away by the promise of a false messiah. As we pull back the curtain on this dark epic, we must look not just at the dates and the battles, but at the shifting tides of the human heart. Because the story of Hitler is ultimately a warning that the most dangerous monsters are the ones we invite into our homes with cheers and applause. And as the red banners of the swastika begin to unfurl in the mind of a young man wandering the streets of Vienna, we must ask ourselves how many times history tried to stop him before it was too late. On a rainy Saturday evening on the 20th of April in 1889, in a modest guest house in the small border town of Braun, Amin, a child was born who would eventually grow to command the most terrifying military machine the world had ever seen. But in those first moments, he was simply Adolf, the fourth child of a stern and aging customs official named Alois Hitler and his much younger, devoted wife Clara. The environment of the Hitler household was one of rigid order and suppressed tension, as Alois was a man who had climbed the social ladder through sheer bureaucratic grit and who demanded absolute, unquestioning obedience from his children. He was a man of quick temper and heavy hands, a man who saw his son not as an individual but as a vessel for his own unfulfilled middle-class ambitions. And this constant friction between a rebellious son and a tyrannical father created the first battlefield of Adolf's life. He learned early on that power was something exercised through fear, and that the only way to survive under a dominant will was to develop a secret. In a world of defiance, while his father pushed him toward the stability of a civil service career, Adolf retreated into the romanticized history of the German people, reading stories of ancient Teutonic knights and the legendary victories of Frederick the Great. He became obsessed with the idea of a greater Germany, a mythical land of purity and strength that stood in stark contrast to the multicultural, decaying reality of the Austro-Hungarian Empire where he lived. His mother Clara was the only source of warmth in this cold house, a woman who doted on her son and provided a sanctuary from the father's rages. And her unconditional love fueled Adolf's budding sense of self-importance, convincing him that he was destined for a greatness that his father could never understand. When he moved to the city of Linz for secondary school, his academic performance began to collapse as he openly rebelled against his teachers, whom he viewed as boring representatives of a failed system. He spent his days wandering the hills and staring at the architecture of the city, imagining how he would one day rebuild it into a monument of his own glory. He became a loner who looked down on his peers, a boy who felt he was a misunderstood genius trapped in the body of a provincial student. And when his father died suddenly of a lung hemorrhage in 1903, Adolf felt a strange mixture of liberation and aimlessness. The anchor of his father's discipline was gone, leaving him free to pursue his dreams of becoming a great artist, but also leaving him without any structure to ground his volatile personality. He convinced his grieving mother to allow him to drop out of school, spending his mid-teens as a dandy of the streets, wearing a silk hat and carrying a cane while he pretended to be a wealthy art student. He would spend hours at the opera house, mesmerized by the heroic dramas of Richard Wagner, whose music provided the soaring, emotional soundtrack to his growing delusions of grandeur. He saw himself as a hero who would one day wake the sleeping German dragon and lead it to a final, apocalyptic victory. But beneath this facade of confidence was a deep-seated fear of mediocrity and a burning resentment toward anyone who dared to question his talent. He was a boy who had never learned to work, only to dream. And as he prepared to leave the quiet hills of Linz for the grand imperial stage of Vienna, he had no idea that he was about to face a series of humiliations that would turn his romantic dreams into a homicidal obsession with race and power. He was a vessel waiting to be filled with the poisons of the age. And as he said goodbye to his mother for the last time, the first chapter of the world's nightmare was already being written in the dust of his footsteps. In 1907, the young Adolf Hitler stepped off the train in the grand and glittering city of Vienna with the burning conviction that he was a genius who would easily conquer the world of art, carrying with him the meager inheritance from his parents and a heart full of romanticized dreams that the prestigious Academy of Fine Arts would immediately recognize his talent. But the reality was a devastating and soul-crushing rejection that would become the foundation of his lifelong hatred for the established order. The admissions officers looked at his sketches and saw only the stiff and lifeless drawings of an architectural draftsman rather than the soul of a true painter, and they informed him with a cold finality that he lacked the artistic spirit required for their institution. This rejection was not just a professional failure, but a personal apocalypse for a young man whose entire identity was built on the belief that he was special. And instead of reflecting on his own limitations, he began to view the academy as a bastion of corrupt elites who were conspiring to keep a true Aryan talent from rising. The situation turned from bad to worse when his beloved mother Clara died of breast cancer shortly after his arrival, leaving him entirely alone in a massive and indifferent city, where his money was rapidly running out and his pride was being systematically dismantled by the day. By 1909, he had fallen into the absolute depths of urban poverty, moving from cheap boarding houses to damp homeless shelters, and finally to a crowded men's hostel in the Gatineau district, where the air was a thick soup of unwashed bodies and the desperate coughs of the dying. It was in this dark and bitter wilderness that Hitler's soul began to ferment with a poisonous mixture of self-loathing and externalized rage. He spent his days in the public libraries not to study medicine or law, but to consume the radical and fringe racial pamphlets of the time, which provided a convenient and terrifying explanation for his own misery. He discovered the writings of Guido von List and Lanz von Liebenfels, who preached a twisted mythology of Ariosophy, where the noble Germanic race was locked in a cosmic struggle against subhuman forces that were trying to pollute their blood and steal their destiny. He began to observe the multicultural chaos of the Austro-Hungarian capital with a growing sense of nausea, seeing the diverse ethnic groups of the empire as a bacterial infection that was destroying the purity of the German people. He became obsessed with the anti-Semitic demagoguery of Karl Lueger, the mayor of Vienna, who used the Jewish question as a political weapon to manipulate the fears of the struggling middle class. Hitler began to view every economic struggle and every social problem through this narrow and lethal lens, convincing himself that a secret international conspiracy of Jewish financiers and Marxists was responsible for both his own failure and the decline of the German nation. He became a coffee-house politician without an audience, cornering the other homeless men in the hostels to deliver long and screaming monologues about the need for a national savior who would cleanse the land of its impurities. His physical appearance began to deteriorate as he wore a long and threadbare overcoat even in the heat of summer and grew a wild beard that hid his youthful face. But in his mind he was already beginning to formulate the new order that would one day replace the democratic filth he saw around him. He learned the power of the big lie and the effectiveness of identifying a single enemy to focus the anger of the masses. And as he spent his nights painting cheap postcards of Viennese buildings to earn enough for a bowl of soup, he was actually sketching the blueprints for a continental genocide. Vienna was the crucible that burned away the last remnants of his humanity and replaced them with a fanatical and cold-blooded ideology of race and space. He left the city in 1913 for Munich, not as a man but as a radicalized weapon of destruction who carried within him a hatred so vast that it would eventually require a world war to satisfy. He viewed his years of poverty not as a tragedy, but as his higher school of learning, where he had discovered the eternal laws of nature which dictated that the strong must consume the weak and that the pure must destroy the tainted if they wish to survive. And as he crossed the border into Germany, he felt a sense of homecoming, as if the land itself was calling for a master who would restore its ancient and blood-stained glory. When the thunder of the First World War exploded across the European continent in August of 1914, Adolf Hitler felt a sudden and ecstatic sense of liberation, as if the very air had been cleared of the suffocating boredom and humiliation of his civilian life. He knelt on the ground in a crowded Munich square and thanked heaven for the chance to live in such a heroic age, immediately volunteering for the Bavarian Army's List Regiment, where he was thrust into the muddy and blood-soaked reality of the Western Front. For the first time in his life, he felt a sense of belonging and a rigid structure that he had lacked. Since the death of his father, the trenches became his true home, and the military hierarchy became his new religion as he served as a regimental runner, a job that required him to sprint through the open no-man's land, under a constant rain of machine gun fire and artillery shrapnel, to deliver vital messages between the command posts. He proved to be an unnervingly brave soldier who seemed to have a supernatural immunity to death, often volunteering for missions that other men considered suicidal and winning the Iron Cross second class and later the first class, which was a rare honor for a common corporal. But his fellow soldiers found him to be a strange and isolated figure who refused to join in their talk of women or home, and instead spent his quiet moments reading political philosophy or staring intensely at the horizon with a look of fanatical devotion. He viewed the war not as a tragedy of human loss, but as a magnificent cleansing fire that would burn away the weakness of the 19th century and forge a new type of Iron Man who was capable of absolute sacrifice for the nation. He learned the mechanics of mass mobilization and the chilling efficiency of industrial-scale slaughter. watching as millions of men were fed into the meat grinder of the front lines with a cold and detached curiosity that stripped away the last of his empathy. He survived the gas attacks at Ypres and the brutal attrition of the Somme, and with every near miss he became more convinced that he was protected by a divine providence that was saving him for a much larger and more terrifying destiny. But the end of the war in 1918 brought with it a psychological collapse that was more profound than any physical wound. As he lay in a military hospital in Payswalk, recovering from temporary blindness caused by a British mustard gas attack, he heard the news of the German surrender and the abdication of the Kaiser. He described this moment as a total darkness that descended upon his soul, where he wept for the first time since his mother's death and felt a homicidal rage toward the November criminals who had allegedly stabbed the army in the back. He believed with a fanatical certainty that Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield, but had been betrayed at home by a conspiracy of Jews and Marxists and democratic politicians who had poisoned the morale of the people. This stab in the back myth became the core of his political awakening as he vowed to enter the arena of power to avenge the shame of the Versailles Treaty and to restore the German Empire to a position of global dominance. He emerged from the hospital, not as a veteran seeking peace, but as a professional agitator who viewed the world as a battlefield where the struggle between nations was eternal and where the only law was the survival of the fittest. The Great War had given him a uniform and a sense of mission and a taste for blood. And as he walked back into the starving and chaotic streets of a defeated Germany, he was ready to start a new kind of war that would use the ballot box as a weapon and the masses as a shield until he could finally unleash the fire of the trenches upon the entire world once again. In the wake of the Great War, the city of Munich became a seething cauldron of political radicalization and street violence, where Adolf Hitler found his true calling not as an artist, but as a demagogue of the beer halls. Having been hired by the military to investigate small political parties, he instead discovered the German Workers' Party and quickly realized that his unique ability to simplify complex grievances into slogans of pure hatred could turn this tiny group into a national movement. He spent the early 1920s perfecting his oratory in smoke-filled rooms where the smell of stale beer and sweat mingled with a desperate longing for a return to imperial glory. He transformed the party into the National Socialist German Workers' Party and adopted the swastika as a symbol of Aryan struggle, surrounding himself with a private army of brown-shirted thugs known as the Sturmabteilung, who used iron bars and brass knuckles to silence any opposition in the streets. By 1923, the economic collapse of Germany and the hyperinflation that made a loaf of bread cost billions of marks provided the perfect atmosphere for a coup attempt. On the night of November 8th, Hitler and his stormtroopers burst into the Bürgerbusch beer hall where the Bavarian state leaders were meeting, and he fired a pistol into the ceiling, declaring that the national revolution had begun. He intended to march on Berlin and overthrow the democratic government, just as Mussolini had recently done in Rome. But his plan was built on the shaky foundations of ego and poor planning rather than military reality. The following morning, as he led a column of 3,000 Nazis toward the center of Munich, they were met at the Feldherrnhalle by a cordon of state police who opened fire without hesitation. 4 policemen and 16 Nazis were killed in a matter of seconds, while Hitler fled the scene with a dislocated shoulder, leaving his followers to bleed in the snow. He was arrested 2 days later in a state of suicidal despair, believing that his political career was finished, and that he would spend the rest of his life in a cold prison cell or face a firing squad for high treason. However, the subsequent trial became his greatest stage as the sympathetic. Judges allowed him to deliver hours of nationalist propaganda to the press, turning the failed coup into a propaganda victory of massive proportions. He walked into the Landsberg prison not as a defeated criminal, but as a martyr for the German cause who had learned the vital lesson that power in a modern state could not be seized by a simple street brawl, but had to be won through a legalistic conquest of the institutions from within. He used his time in the comfortable prison cell to begin dictating his dark manifesto to his loyal secretary Rudolf Hess, realizing that his period of forced rest was actually a divine opportunity to refine his ideology of race and space into a weapon that would eventually decapitate the Republic. While confined within the thick stone walls of Landsberg prison, Adolf Hitler began to construct the most dangerous book of the 20th century, a rambling and vitriolic work titled Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, which served as both a fictionalized autobiography and a terrifyingly precise blueprint for the destruction of European civilization. In these pages, he articulated his core belief that human history was nothing more than a perpetual and biological struggle between races, where the Aryan was the creator of all culture and the Jew was the parasite that sought to destroy it through the twin poisons of international finance and Bolshevik revolution. He argued with a cold and clinical madness that Germany's only path to survival lay in the conquest of Lebens, or living space in the East, specifically targeting the vast fertile plains of Russia and Ukraine, which he believed were the natural right of the German people to occupy and exploit. He rejected the very idea of human equality as a Jewish invention designed to weaken the strong, and he openly mocked the democratic system as a rotting corpse that needed to be pushed aside by a singular Führer who embodied the mystical will of the nation. The book was initially ignored by the mainstream public, who dismissed it as the ravings of a failed revolutionary. But for Hitler, it was a sacred text that provided a roadmap for everything he would later do, from the Nuremberg laws to the invasion of Poland and the horrors of the gas chambers. He realized during his months in prison that the masses were not moved by logic or reason, but by primitive emotions like fear and pride, and a longing for a strong master to tell them what to do. He refined his theories of propaganda, arguing that the big lie must be told with such conviction and repeated so often that the people would eventually accept it as the absolute truth, regardless of how absurd it might be. When he was released from prison in December of 1924, he was no longer a disorganized street fighter, but a calculated political predator who had a long-term strategy for the total subversion of the German state. He reorganized the Nazi Party as a cult of personality where every member was required to swear a personal oath of loyalty to him alone, and he began to build a massive organizational machine that included youth groups and women's leagues, and even a secret police force to monitor his own followers. He was prepared to wait for the next economic or social crisis to strike, knowing that the seeds of hate he had planted in his book would only bloom in a climate of absolute despair. He had written his intentions for the world to see, but the world chose not to listen, believing that he was a relic of a chaotic past, rather than the herald of a catastrophic future. And as he looked out over the Bavarian mountains, he knew that the struggle he had described in his cell was just the beginning of a much larger war that would eventually demand the sacrifice of millions of lives to fulfill his singular and pathological vision of a 1,000-year Reich. Following his release from Lands prison, Adolf Hitler found himself in a Germany that seemed to have recovered from the brink of collapse as the introduction of the Rentenmark and the influx of American loans under the Dawes Plan created a period of relative stability known as the Golden Twenties, a time of jazz and cinema and intellectual freedom that left the radicalism of the Nazi Party appearing like a fading ghost of a chaotic past. The party itself was banned in several German states, and Hitler was initially forbidden from speaking in public in much of the country. Yet it was during these wilderness years that he displayed his most dangerous talent for organizational discipline and strategic patience. He realized that the beer hall tactics of the past would never succeed against a stabilized state, so he set about rebuilding the National Socialist German Workers' Party as a legalistic but highly militarized shadow government. He divided the map of Germany into regions called Gauls and appointed loyal Gauleiters, who acted as his personal lieutenants in every corner of the nation, ensuring that the Nazi message was being whispered in the ears of the disillusioned even when it could not be shouted from the podiums. He founded the Schutzstaffel, or the SS, as a small and elite bodyguard composed of men who swore a fanatical oath of personal loyalty to him alone, creating a state within the party that was characterized by an absolute and terrifying obedience, while the rest of Germany enjoyed the brief sunshine of the Weimar republics. Recovery Hitler spent his days in his mountain retreat at Obersalzberg, refining his public image and waiting for the inevitable crack in the foundations of the global economy. He cultivated a cadre of devoted subordinates like Joseph Goebbels, who understood the psychological mechanics of mass persuasion and who began to build a massive propaganda machine that utilized the latest technologies of film and radio and high-speed printing. They didn't just sell a political platform, they sold a cult of personality centered on the Führer as the only man who could restore German dignity. Despite their low polling numbers, which saw the party receive less than 3% of the vote in 1928, the structural machine was now perfectly tuned and waiting for a crisis to ignite it. Hitler was a man who understood that history is not a steady climb, but a series of violent shocks, and he was the only one prepared to exploit the next disaster to its absolute limit. He had turned his band of street brawlers into a disciplined political army, and as the decade drew to a close, he watched the rising stock prices of Wall Street with the cold eyes of a predator who knew that a great fall was coming, and that in the darkness of the collapse his shadow would finally cover the entire land. The turning point that Adolf Hitler had been waiting for arrived with a shattering impact in October of 1929, when the Wall Street crash triggered a global economic depression that hit Germany harder than perhaps any other industrialized nation. Within months, the American loans that had sustained the German recovery were withdrawn, and the factories of the Ruhr Valley fell silent as millions of workers were thrown onto the streets with no hope and no food. The democratic government of the Weimar Republic was paralyzed by internal bickering and an inability to solve the crisis, which led to a catastrophic collapse of public trust in the very idea of democracy. For Hitler, this was the golden opportunity he had described in his cell at Landsberg, and he unleashed his propaganda machine with a relentless and terrifying intensity. Joseph Goebbels organized thousands of meetings across the country where the Nazis promised work and bread and identified a simple list of enemies to blame for the suffering: the Jews, the Communists, and the November criminals who had signed the Treaty of Versailles. The Nazi message resonated with a middle class that had lost its savings, and a working class that had lost its dignity, and a youth that had lost its future. In the Reichstag elections of September 1930, the Nazi Party achieved a stunning and world-shaking breakthrough, increasing their seats from 12 to 107 and becoming the second largest party in the country almost overnight. Hitler was no longer a fringe radical, but a central player in the game of power, who was now courted by the industrial elites and the conservative generals who believed they could use his mass appeal to crush the left and then discard him when the job was done. But Hitler was a man who could not be used and who would not be discarded, as he spent his time traveling by plane across Germany, the first politician to do so. An image of a modern and dynamic leader who was everywhere at once. His speeches became more mystical and more apocalyptic as he told the crowds that the time for debate was over and the time for a national awakening had come. He used the chaos in the streets where his brown-shirted SA fought daily battles with communist militias to argue that only his movement could restore law and order through the imposition of a singular will. The Great Depression had provided the soil of despair, and Hitler was now reaping the harvest of hate with a calculated efficiency that left the traditional politicians baffled and powerless. He had realized that in a time of absolute crisis, the people do not want a policy, they want a messiah. And he was more than willing to play that role until he could finally grasp the throat of the Republic and never let go. By 1931, the atmosphere in the Weimar Republic had reached a state of feverish and violent insanity as the economic depression deepened and the streets of Berlin and Munich became a literal war zone between the Nazi brown shirts and the communist red front. Adolf Hitler realized that the final barrier to his absolute power was the aging and legendary President Paul von Hindenburg, the 84-year-old hero of the First World War, who viewed the Bohemian corporal with a mixture of aristocratic disdain and deep-seated suspicion. In a move of extreme political daring, Hitler decided to challenge the venerable Field Marshal for the presidency in 1932. A campaign that changed the nature of modern politics forever, as Joseph Goebbels organized the Hitler over Germany tour, where the Nazi leader used a private plane to visit 20 cities in a single week, appearing to the masses as a dynamic and almost supernatural figure who descended from the clouds to save the nation. While Hindenburg represented the fading dignity of the old Prussian order, Hitler represented the raw and terrifying energy of the future, speaking in a hoarse and hypnotic voice to millions about the national resurrection and the biological necessity of German dominance. Although Hitler lost the election to Hindenburg, the results were a staggering victory for the Nazi movement as they doubled their vote to 13 million. And proved that they were now the largest political force in the country that could no longer be ignored or suppressed. The political elite in Berlin began a series of desperate and backroom machinations to tame the Nazi leader, led by the ambitious and devious Franz von Papen, who believed that he could use Hitler's mass appeal to provide a popular base for his own conservative agenda while keeping the shouting corporal in a decorative and powerless role. The year 1932 saw 5 major elections that left the German people exhausted and the democratic system in a state of total paralysis, as the Reichstag became a theater of the absurd. where no majority could be formed and the government was forced to rule by emergency decree. Hitler remained stubbornly focused on his goal of becoming Chancellor with absolute powers, refusing to accept any secondary cabinet positions, and telling his followers that the 1,000-year Reich was within their grasp. If they only held their ground in the face of the dying republic. The psychological pressure on the German population was immense, as the constant noise of propaganda and the sight of jackbooted men in the streets created a sense of inevitable doom. A feeling that the old world was ending and that a new and darker age was waiting to be born out of the chaos of the ballot box. The final days of January 1933 were a period of intense and shadowy intrigue. In the halls of the Reich Chancellery, where the fate of the nation was decided not by the voters, but by a small circle of aging men who believed they were playing a clever game of chess with the devil, Franz von Papen finally convinced the reluctant and senile President Hindenburg that the only way to achieve stability was to appoint Adolf Hitler as Chancellor, with Papen himself serving as Vice-Chancellor to box him in and keep him under control. On the morning of January 30th, Hitler was officially sworn in as the head of the German government, an event that he had spent 14 years of his life dreaming of, and which he immediately transformed into a massive propaganda spectacle. As the sun set over Berlin, thousands of brown shirts marched through the Brandenburg Gate in a torchlight procession that turned the city streets into a river of fire, signaling to the world that the national awakening had finally arrived and that the era of democracy was over. The intellectual and liberal elites of Berlin watched in stunned silence from their balconies, many of them still believing that Hitler was a temporary madness that would be tamed by the responsibilities of office, or by the weight of the traditional bureaucracy. But Hitler had no intention of being tamed, as he immediately began to use the machinery of the state to dismantle every check and balance that stood in his way. He called for a new round of elections to clarify his mandate, and he unleashed the SS and the SA to terrorize his political opponents with a newfound legal immunity. He understood that he had been given the keys to the kingdom, and he was prepared to burn the kingdom down to ensure that he never had to give them back. The appointment of Hitler as Chancellor was not the result of a revolutionary coup, but a legalistic surrender by a failed elite who had lost their nerve and their moral compass in the face of absolute fanatical resolve. Within weeks, the first concentration camps were being prepared to house the enemies of the state, and the first decrees were being drafted to strip Jewish citizens of their rights. The Republic was dead, although its heart would continue to beat in a state of terminal terror for a few more months, while the Nazi machine systematically consumed every institution of German life. Hitler stood at the window of the Chancellery, looking out at the cheering crowds with the cold eyes of a man who knew that his struggle had finally transitioned from the beer halls to the control of a modern industrial state, and he prepared to lead the nation on a march that would lead directly into the mouth of the abyss. In the late evening of February 27th, 1933, the sky over Berlin was illuminated by a terrifying orange glow as the Reichstag, the symbolic heart of German democracy, was engulfed in a massive and suspicious fire that provided Adolf Hitler with the ultimate pretext to dismantle the rule of law forever. While the building burned, Hitler and Joseph Goebbels arrived on the scene and immediately declared that the fire was a signal for a massive communist uprising intended to plunge the nation into a bloody civil war. Although a young Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe was found at the scene, the Nazis used the chaos of the moment to launch a pre-planned wave of mass arrests, targeting thousands of social democrats and communists and intellectuals who were dragged from their beds and taken to makeshift torture chambers in the basements of SA barracks. Within 24 hours, Hitler convinced the aging president, Hindenburg, to sign the Reichstag fire decree, which suspended all individual rights and freedoms, including the right to free speech and assembly and the privacy of the post and telegraph. This decree effectively turned Germany into a police state overnight, as the government gained the power to arrest anyone without charge and to confiscate property and to override the laws of the individual German states. Hitler utilized the atmosphere of national panic to justify the presence of his brown-shirted thugs on every street corner, claiming that only the Nazi Party stood between the German people and the Red Terror that had supposedly torched the parliament. He understood that fear was the most potent tool in the hands of a dictator, and he used the smoldering ruins of the Reichstag to incinerate the last remnants of the constitutional order, while the public was too terrified and confused to resist. The fire was not just the end of a building, but the end of a century of liberal progress, as the legal foundations of the Republic were replaced by a state of permanent emergency where the will of the Führer was the only law that mattered. In March of 1933, the newly elected members of the Reichstag gathered at the Kroll Opera House, which served as a temporary parliament because the original building remained a blackened shell, but the atmosphere inside was less like a democratic assembly and more like a military tribunal, as the corridors were lined with rows of armed SS and SA men who chanted, "We want the bill," or "fire and murder," to intimidate the opposition. Hitler appeared before the deputies, not in a suit, but in a brown party uniform, to demand the passage of the Enabling Act, a law that would grant him the power to enact legislation and sign treaties without the consent of the parliament or the president for a period of 4 years. This was the final and most audacious step in his legalistic revolution, as he promised the conservative and religious parties that he would protect their interests, while his thugs blocked the entrance of the socialist deputies, who had not already been arrested or forced into hiding. The courageous social democrat Otto Wels was the only man who dared to speak against the bill, telling Hitler to his face that freedom and life can be taken from us, but not our honor, to which Hitler responded with a screaming and vitriolic tirade that mocked the very idea of parliamentary dignity. The bill passed by a crushing majority because the center-right parties had been seduced by Hitler's promises or broken by his threats, and with the stroke of a pen the parliament effectively voted itself out of existence and handed the absolute power of life and death to a single man. The Enabling Act completed the Gleichschaltung, or the synchronization of German life, where every club and every union and every professional organization was forced to align itself with Nazi ideology or be dissolved. Hitler had achieved the goal of becoming a legal dictator, and he immediately began to use his new powers to purge the civil service and to ban all other political parties and to establish the first official concentration camp at Dachau for the re-education of those who still dared to dream of a different future. He had dismantled a democracy using its own laws, and he stood now as the undisputed master of Germany, ready to begin the long and blood-stained process of preparing the nation for a global war of racial annihilation by the summer of 1934. Adolf Hitler faced a critical internal crisis that threatened to tear his young regime apart, as the 4 million members of his private army, the Sturmabteilung, or SA, led by the coarse and ambitious Ernst Röhm, began to demand a second revolution that would sweep away the traditional military elite and the wealthy industrialists who had supported Hitler's rise. Röhm envisioned a massive people's militia where the SB would absorb the regular army and he would serve as the supreme commander of all German forces, a proposal that horrified the professional generals of the Reichswehr, who viewed the brown-shirted thugs as a disorganized and undisciplined mob. Hitler found himself caught between the revolutionary zeal of his oldest comrades and the necessity of winning the support of the military and the big businesses that were essential for his plans of rearmament and conquest, encouraged by the ambitious heads of the SS and the Gestapo, specifically Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, who fabricated evidence of an imminent coup by Hitler, decided to strike with a cold and terrifying ruthlessness to eliminate the threat from within his own ranks. On the morning of June 30th, 1934, in an event known as the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler personally led a squad of SS men to the Hanselbauer Hotel in Bad Wiessee, where he burst into Röhm's bedroom and arrested him, while similar squads across Germany began to round up and execute hundreds of high-ranking SA leaders and political rivals who had nothing to do with the supposed mutiny. The purge lasted for 3 days, as the SS and the Gestapo settled old scores in a wave of extrajudicial killings that claimed the lives of former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher and the conservative critic Edgar Jung, and many others who had dared to cross the Führer in the past. Röhm was given a pistol in his jail cell to commit suicide, but when he refused, he was gunned down by 2 SS officers while he reportedly stood in a defiant stance with his chest bared. This blood purge was a historic turning point because it signaled to the German people that the law was now whatever the Führer decided it was, and it cemented the alliance between Hitler and the traditional military, who were so relieved to see the SA destroyed that they willingly looked the other way as their former colleagues were murdered in cold blood. Hitler appeared before the Reichstag shortly after to declare that in that hour he was the supreme judge of the German people, and that he had acted to save the nation from a catastrophic civil war, a lie that was accepted with a mixture of fear and relieved gratitude by a public that longed for order at any cost. The SA was reduced to a purely ceremonial role, while the SS emerged as the most powerful and feared instrument of terror in the Nazi state, answerable only to Hitler himself, and the path was now clear for the total militarization of Germany under a single, unchallenged will. In August of 1930, for the last remaining obstacle to Hitler's absolute and total control over the German state was removed when the 86-year-old president, Paul von Hindenburg, died at his country estate in New, leaving the office of the presidency vacant and the nation in a state of mourning for the man who had symbolized the continuity of the old Prussian order. Even before the president's heart had stopped beating, Hitler's cabinet had already passed a law that combined the offices of Chancellor and President into a new and unprecedented position called the Führer and Reich Chancellor, effectively making Hitler the head of state, the head of government, and the supreme commander of all armed forces in a single stroke of administrative genius. To ensure that the military would never again be able to challenge his authority, Hitler replaced the traditional oath of allegiance to the Constitution or the nation with a new and personal oath of loyalty known as the Hitler Oath, which every officer and soldier in the German army was required to recite. In this chilling ceremony, millions of men stood with their hands raised and swore by God to render unconditional obedience to the Führer of the German Reich and people, Adolf Hitler, and to be prepared as a brave soldier to stake their lives for this oath at any time. This was not a vow to a country or a flag, but a mystical and unbreakable bond to a single individual which turned the entire German military into a private tool of Hitler's personal ambitions and made any act of resistance a crime of treason and a violation of a sacred religious promise. Hitler then called for a national plebiscite to confirm his new powers, and despite the climate of intense propaganda and intimidation, over 90% of the German people voted in favor of his absolute rule, signaling their total surrender to the cult of personality that had been carefully constructed by Joseph Goebbels. He was now the undisputed master of Germany, whom the law could no longer touch, and whose word was the final authority on every matter of life and death within the Reich. The Thousand-Year Reich was no longer a slogan, but a reality that was being built on the ruins of the Republic and the death of the old guard, and Hitler began to turn his gaze away from internal consolidation and toward the global stage, where he intended to use his new and fanatical army to redraw the map of Europe. In accordance with the dark theories of race and space he had written in his prison cell a decade earlier, he had become the state, and the state had become his weapon, and the world was about to discover the full and terrifying meaning of a nation that had traded its soul for the promise of a master who would lead them to glory or to the grave. By 1935, the Nazi regime had successfully consolidated its grip on the machinery of the state, and Adolf Hitler felt the time was ripe to codify his pathological hatred of the Jewish people into a permanent and inescapable legal framework known as the Nuremberg Laws, which were unveiled during the massive and theatrical Rally of Freedom, where hundreds of thousands of jackbooted soldiers and fanatical supporters gathered in a sea of red banners to hear the Führer declare a new biological order for Germany. These laws were not merely discriminatory, but were designed to systematically strip a specific group of humans of their very right to exist within the civil society by defining citizenship not by residence or loyalty, but by the cold and pseudo-scientific metric of blood and soil. The Reich citizenship law declared that only those of German or related blood could be citizens of the Reich with full political rights, while the law for the protection of German blood and German honor prohibited marriages and extramarital relations between Jews and Germans under the penalty of imprisonment and hard labor. This was the ultimate triumph of the fringe racial theories that Hitler had consumed in the libraries of Vienna years earlier, as the state began to issue complex charts to determine who was a full Jew or a Micheling of the first or second degree based on the number of their grandparents who belonged to the Jewish religious community. These laws effectively turned the Jewish population into a trapped and defenseless caste of subjects who were barred from public office and professional life, and even from flying the national flag, creating a social and legal ghetto that served as a psychological training ground for the German public to view their neighbors as alien parasites and biological threats. Hitler watched with satisfaction as the professional classes, including lawyers and doctors and academics, willingly implemented these laws, proving that the elite of the nation had traded their moral conscience for a place in the new racial hierarchy. The Nuremberg laws were the legal bridge between the random street violence of the early Nazi movement and the industrial scale slaughter of the final solution, as they provided the bureaucratic foundation for the eventual confiscation of property and the forced deportations that would follow. The world looked on with a mixture of concern and indifference as Germany transformed into a state where the law was no longer a shield for the individual, but a sword in the hand of a dictator who was preparing to expand his racial crusade across the borders of Europe. In the early spring of 1936, Adolf Hitler decided to launch his most audacious and dangerous gamble to date by ordering a small force of 30,000 1,000 troops to march into the Rhineland, a strategically vital region on the border of France that had been declared a demilitarized zone by the Treaty of Versailles and the Locarno Pact. This was a move of extreme military risk because the German army was still in the early stages of its rebuilding and was no match for the massive French military machine, which had nearly 100 divisions ready to crush any German provocation. Hitler's own generals were paralyzed with fear, and many of them begged him to reconsider because they knew that if the French had moved their troops forward, the German forces would have been forced to retreat in total humiliation, which would have likely led to a coup against the Nazi regime. But Hitler had a gambler's instinct for the weakness and the indecision of the Western democracies, and he correctly calculated that the French and the British were too weary of war and too divided by internal politics to take a stand over a piece of land that many in London believed was merely Germany's own backyard. On March 7th, 1936, the first German battalions crossed the bridges of the Rhine and were met not by French shells but by cheering crowds of civilians who threw flowers at the feet of the soldiers as the world watched in stunned silence at the blatant violation of international law. The success of this gamble was a massive psychological victory for Hitler because it proved to the German people that he could achieve great national triumphs through a policy of brinkmanship without firing a single shot, and it shattered the authority of the old guard generals who had doubted his intuition. He used this triumph to further solidify his cult of personality as a man of peace, who was merely correcting the injustices of the past while he was actually using the breathing space provided by the Western inaction to accelerate the construction of the Siegfried Line and to prepare for a much larger and more violent expansion into the east. The remilitarization of the Rhineland was the last moment when the Western powers could have stopped Hitler with minimal effort, but their failure to act convinced the Führer that he was a man of destiny, who was invincible, and it paved the way for the annexation of Austria and the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia as the Red Shadow began to stretch further across the map of Europe. In July of 1936, a violent military uprising in Spain, led by General Francisco Franco, provided Adolf Hitler with a perfect geopolitical opportunity to distract the Western powers while simultaneously testing his newly rebuilt military machine in a real-world laboratory of death. Hitler viewed the Spanish conflict not just as a struggle between fascism and communism, but as a vital training ground for his pilots and tank commanders, and as a way to forge a permanent alliance with the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. He dispatched the Condor Legion, which was an elite unit of the Luftwaffe equipped with the latest Messerschmitt fighters and Heinkel bombers to provide decisive air support to the nationalist rebels, while the rest of the world looked on in a state of paralyzed neutrality. This intervention allowed Hitler to experiment with the terrifying new concept of carpet bombing and close air support, which would later become the backbone of his blitzkrieg strategy that would eventually overwhelm the European continent. The most infamous moment of this intervention occurred in April of 1937, when German planes leveled the ancient Basque town of Guernica in a daylight raid that targeted innocent civilians to test the psychological effects of total aerial destruction. Hitler watched the results with a cold and clinical interest, realizing that the terror caused by falling fire could break the will of a nation long before the ground troops even arrived on the scene. While the war in Spain dragged on for 3 years, it successfully drove a wedge between the Western democracies and the Soviet Union, and it allowed Germany to refine its military technology and its radio communications in a way that no peacetime exercise could ever replicate. By the time Franco emerged victorious in 1939, Hitler had achieved a strategic triumph on the cheap because he had secured a friendly regime on France's southern border and had transformed his air force into the most lethal and experienced strike force in the world. He had used the blood of Spain to sharpen the claws of the German eagle, and he was now ready to turn his gaze back to Central Europe, where his plans for a greater German Reich were about to enter their most aggressive and explosive phase. In March of 1930, Adolf Hitler finally fulfilled the dream of his youth by orchestrating the the forced annexation of his native Austria into the German Reich, a move that was achieved through a masterclass in political bullying and psychological warfare. He summoned the Austrian Chancellor, Kurt von Schuschnigg, to his mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden, where he unleashed a screaming and vitriolic tirade of threats and insults, demanding that the Austrian government surrender its sovereignty and appoint Nazi sympathizers to the most powerful cabinet positions. When Schuschnigg attempted to call for a national referendum to let the Austrian people decide their own fate, Hitler was so enraged by this act of defiance that he ordered his generals to prepare for an immediate invasion of his homeland. Under the threat of total military destruction, the Austrian government collapsed from within, and on the morning of March 12, 1938, German tanks and motorized infantry rolled across the border into a nation that was too terrified to offer even a single shot of resistance. Instead of being met with shells, the German troops were greeted by cheering crowds and a rain of flowers as the local Nazi supporters emerged from the shadows to seize control of the streets and begin a wave of public humiliation and violence against the Jewish population of Vienna. Hitler himself made a triumphant entry into the city where he had once lived as a penniless vagabond, and he stood on the balcony of the Hofburg Palace to announce to a crowd of hundreds of thousands that his homeland had finally returned to the great German family. This was the ultimate personal victory for a man who had spent his life feeling rejected by the Viennese elite, and he used the occasion to unleash a terrifying wave of arrests and cleansing that saw tens of thousands of his political opponents and Jewish citizens dragged into the new concentration camps that were being built across the Austrian landscape. The Western powers once again did nothing but offer a few hollow diplomatic protests, which further convinced Hitler that he was a man of destiny whom no one had the courage to stop, and that the international treaties designed to protect the borders of Europe were nothing more than worthless scraps of paper. The annexation of Austria added 7 million people and a vast wealth of natural resources to the Reich, and it placed the German army in a position to surround Czechoslovakia from 3 sides, setting the stage for the next and even more dangerous crisis that would lead the world to the very brink of an all-out global apocalypse. By the autumn of 1938, Adolf Hitler had turned his predatory gaze toward Czechoslovakia, a prosperous and democratic state that stood as a strategic barrier to his eastward expansion. He manufactured a crisis by inciting the ethnic German minority in the Sudetenland border regions to demand autonomy. using his propaganda machine to broadcast fabricated stories of Czech atrocities against Germans to whip the German public into a state of war fever. The world watched in terror as Hitler moved his divisions to the border, threatening to ignite a second Great War if his territorial demands were not met immediately. In a desperate attempt to preserve peace at any cost, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and the French Premier Édouard Daladier flew to Munich to meet with Hitler and Mussolini, excluding the Czechs from the very meeting that would decide their national survival. In the cold halls of the Feuerbo, Hitler played the part of a man whose patience was exhausted, successfully bullying the Western leaders into signing the Munich Agreement, which handed the Sudetenland to Germany in exchange for a hollow promise that this was his last territorial demand in Europe. Chamberlain returned to London, waving a piece of paper and claiming peace for our time. But Hitler viewed the agreement with secret contempt, privately raging that he had been cheated out of a short, victorious war by the elderly Western diplomats, whom he described as little worms. The betrayal at Munich shattered the Czech defenses and proved to Hitler that the Western democracies lacked the will to fight for their principles, allowing him to occupy the rest of the country only months later and convincing him that the path to a racial empire in the East was now wide open because no one had the courage to bar his way. In November of 1938, the Nazi regime's campaign of legal discrimination against the Jewish people exploded into a night of state-sponsored domestic terrorism known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass, a turning point that signaled the end of any remaining pretense of civil order within the Reich. The pretext for the violence was the assassination of a minor German diplomat in Paris by a desperate Jewish teenager, but the response was a meticulously organized pogrom, directed by Joseph Goebbels and Reinhard Heydrich under Hitler's direct approval. Throughout the night of November 9th and into the 10th, organized mobs of SA and SS men in civilian clothes smashed the windows of over 7,000 Jewish-owned businesses and set fire to hundreds of synagogues across Germany and Austria. The air was thick with the smell of burning Torah scrolls and the sound of shattering glass as the police were ordered not to intervene unless the fires threatened Aryan property. Over 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and dragged away to concentration camps like Buchenwald and Dachau, marking the first time the state used mass incarceration as a tool of racial policy on such a vast scale. In a final and grotesque act of cruelty, the Nazi government fined the Jewish community 1 billion marks to pay for the damage caused by the mobs and confiscated their insurance payouts to fund the German rearmament program. Kristallnacht was a psychological threshold for the German public, as those who were horrified into silence realized that the state had now abandoned all moral boundaries and that the legal persecution of the past had transitioned into a physical war of annihilation. The international outcry was immense, but Hitler remained indifferent to the world's condemnation, realizing that the Night of Broken Glass had successfully cleared the way for the total Aryanization of the German economy and the final brutal exclusion of Jews from all aspects of European life. He had tested the conscience of his own people and the resolve of the world, and found both to be lacking, emboldening him to prepare for the ultimate conflict that would take these local horrors and amplify them into a global catastrophe. By the summer of 1939, the diplomatic landscape of Europe had become a hall of mirrors, where Adolf Hitler prepared his final master of deception by reaching out to his most bitter ideological enemy, Joseph Stalin, to form a cynical and world-shaking alliance known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. For years Hitler had preached that the Soviet Union was a Jewish Bolshevik plague that had to be eradicated. Yet he was now willing to shake hands with the devil himself because he realized that a secret deal with Moscow would prevent a two-front war and allow him to crush Poland without the fear of Russian intervention. The world was stunned into a state of absolute disbelief when the news of the treaty was announced, as it paired the two most murderous dictators of the century in a pact of convenience that was built on a foundation of mutual loathsome suspicion. Hidden within the public documents was a secret protocol that carved up Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, essentially signing the death warrant of Poland and the Baltic states and giving Stalin a free hand in Finland. Hitler viewed this pact as a temporary marriage of necessity that would allow him to secure his eastern flank while he dealt with the Western democracies, and he mocked the idea of long-term peace with the subhuman Slavs whom he still intended to enslave or destroy at a later date. The pact was the ultimate expression of Hitler's real, where he proved that his fanatical ideology could be paused for the sake of cold-blooded strategic advantage, and it left the British and the French in a state of diplomatic paralysis as their entire policy of containment collapsed in a single night. As the ink dried on the signatures in the Kremlin, Hitler gave the order for his generals to prepare for Case White, the invasion of Poland, knowing that he had neutralized the only power capable of stopping him in the East, and that the fuse for the second global apocalypse had finally been lit. On the dawn of September 1st, 1939, the silence of the Polish border was shattered by the roar of over 2,000 German tanks and the screaming engines of the Luftwaffe as Adolf Hitler unleashed blitzkrieg or lightning war upon a nation that was still partially mobilizing its horse-mounted cavalry against the most modern industrial military machine on earth. The invasion was preceded by a clumsy and staged false flag operation where SS soldiers dressed in Polish uniforms attacked a German radio station at Gliwice to provide Hitler with a hollow pretext of self-defense, which he used to justify the total annihilation of the Polish state. Within hours, the Polish Air Force was largely destroyed on the ground, and the German panzer divisions were slicing through the countryside with a speed and ferocity that the world had never seen before, as they bypassed fortified positions and utilized radio communications to coordinate massive air and ground assaults. Hitler watched the progress of the campaign from his armored train, the America, with a sense of ecstatic triumph, realizing that his theory of mechanized warfare was functioning with a terrifying clinical precision that rendered traditional defensive strategies obsolete. The campaign was characterized by a new and dark level of brutality as the Einsatzgruppen, or special task forces, followed behind the regular army to systematically execute thousands of Polish priests and intellectuals and Jews as part of Hitler's plan to decapitate the Polish nation and turn its survivors into a pool of illiterate slave labor. The tragedy was compounded on September 17th when the Soviet Union honored its secret bargain with Hitler and invaded Poland from the east, trapping the Polish army in a hopeless and suffocating vice between two of history's greatest monsters. By the end of the month, the city of Warsaw lay in ruins under a relentless rain of fire, and the Polish state ceased to exist as its territory was partitioned between the Reich and the Soviet Union, while the Western powers declared war but remained safely behind the Maginot Line in a state of sitzkrieg or phony war. Hitler had successfully opened the gates of hell and proved that his fanatical will was now backed by a military machine that could rewrite the map of the world in a matter of weeks, and he prepared to turn his gaze toward the West, where he intended to settle the old scores of 1918 with a violence that would dwarf the memory of the Great War. In the spring of 1940, Adolf Hitler unleashed a military masterstroke that shattered the global balance of power and humiliated the Western democracies in a matter of weeks. As he turned his blitzkrieg machine toward the West with a plan so daring that even his own veteran generals trembled at the risk, while the French and British forces waited behind the seemingly impregnable Maginot Line and the forests of Belgium, Hitler approved the Monstein Plan, which called for a massive and concentrated armored thrust through the rugged and supposedly impassable terrain of the Ardennes forest. On May 10th, the German panzer divisions, led by commanders like Guderian and Rommel, sliced through the thin Allied defences like a hot knife through butter, reaching the English Channel in just 10 days, and trapping the cream of the French and British armies in a desperate pocket at Dunkirk. Hitler watched the collapse of his greatest rivals with a mixture of disbelief and ecstatic triumph as the invincible French army, the very force that had dictated the terms of the Versailles Treaty, disintegrated into a panicked and disorganized rabble. When the city of Paris fell without a fight on June 14th, Hitler experienced the supreme moment of his life. Traveling to the forest of Campion to force the French delegation to sign their surrender in the exact same railway carriage where Germany had been humbled in 1918. He performed a celebratory jig that was captured on film for the world to see. A moment of pure and vengeful joy for a man who had spent 20 years nursing the wounds of the First War. He stood as the undisputed master of Europe, controlling a territory that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the borders of the Soviet Union. And he began to imagine himself as a modern-day Charlemagne or Napoleon whose 1,000-year Reich was no longer a fever dream but a concrete reality. Yet even as he stood on the balcony of a conquered Paris and gazed at the Eiffel Tower, he remained obsessed with the one enemy that refused to bow to his will. As the British miraculously evacuated their troops from Dunkirk to fight another day, Hitler realized that the war was not yet over, and that to truly secure his empire, he would either have to crush the island nation from the air or turn back to his original and most obsessive goal, the total destruction of the Slavic East and the fulfillment of his dark promise of Lebensraum in the plains of Russia. On the dawn of June 22nd, 1941, Adolf Hitler launched the largest and most murderous military operation in human history by ordering over 3 million German and Axis troops to invade the Soviet Union in a campaign known as Operation Barbarossa. This was not merely a conventional war for territory, but was the ultimate expression of Hitler's Weltanschauung or worldview, a crusade of racial annihilation designed to wipe Jewish Bolshevism off the face of the earth and to clear the way for German settlers to occupy the vast lands of the East. He ignored the warnings of his intelligence officers about the immense reserves of the Red Army and the brutal reality of the Russian winter, believing with a fanatical and delusional certainty that we only have to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. The initial successes were staggering as the German panzers surrounded and captured millions of Soviet soldiers in massive kessels, Lachtin or battles of reaching the gates of Leningrad and Moscow within months. But this campaign was characterized by a new and terrifying level of organized barbarism as the Commissar Order instructed German officers to execute all political officials of the Soviet state on the spot, and the Einsatzgruppen followed the front lines to conduct mass shootings of Jewish men, women, and children in the pits of Babi Yar and beyond. Hitler viewed the Slavic people as untermenschen, or subhumans, who were destined only for slavery or death, and he ordered the systematic starvation of the occupied territories to feed his own army and the German civilian population. However, as the autumn rains turned the Russian roads into bottomless bogs and the first snows of a record-breaking winter began to fall, the momentum of the Blitzkrieg began to stall against the sheer depth of the Russian landscape and the fanatical resistance of a people who realized they were fighting for their very existence. By December, the German troops were freezing to death in summer uniforms, within sight of the Kremlin spires, as the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive that proved for the first time that Hitler was not invincible. The war of annihilation had become a war of attrition that the German economy was not prepared to win. Yet Hitler remained unmoved by the staggering loss of life, blaming his generals for the failure and taking personal command of the entire army. He had finally unleashed the apocalyptic conflict he had dreamed of in his prison cell. But in doing so, he had awakened a sleeping giant that would eventually follow his retreating armies, all the way back to the heart of Berlin. As the tides of the war began to turn against the Reich, on the frozen plains of Russia, Adolf Hitler's obsession with the Jewish question transitioned from a policy of forced emigration and local massacres into a state-mandated program of industrial-scale genocide known as the Final Solution. In January of 1942, high-ranking Nazi officials gathered at the Wannsee Conference to coordinate the logistics of a continental massacre that would utilize the efficiency of the German civil service and the railway system to transport millions of innocent people to their deaths. Hitler had always believed that the war was merely a cover for his true mission of biological purification, and he ordered the construction of specialized extermination camps like Auschwitz, Birkenau, and Treblinka, and Belzec, where the machinery of modern industry was repurposed for the systematic gassing of Jewish families and Romani people and political dissidents. The air over Poland became thick with the constant ash of the crematoria as the Nazi regime turned the murder of humans into a bureaucratic process with its own ledgers and its own quotas and its own horrific innovations like Zyklon B. Hitler himself rarely spoke of the details in public, but his secret speeches to his generals and Gauleiters made it clear that he viewed the total eradication of the Jewish race as his greatest legacy and as a cleansing service to the world. Even as his armies were being crushed at Stalingrad and North Africa, he prioritized the movement of death trains over the transport of military reinforcements, proving that his fanatical hatred was more powerful than his instinct for military survival. The Holocaust was the ultimate destination of the ideology that had begun in the flophouses of Vienna, as the state became a factory of death that stripped away the dignity of millions before extinguishing their lives in the dark. And as the Allied armies closed in on the borders of the Reich, they began to uncover the skeletal survivors and the mountains of hair and shoes and gold teeth that stood as a silent and terrifying testament to the depths of depravity that a modern nation can reach when it is led by a man who has replaced morality with a cold and clinical madness of the blood. By the spring of 1945, the 1,000-year Reich had shrunk to a few square Miles of rubble in the center of Berlin as the Soviet Red Army launched its final assault, and Adolf Hitler retreated 50 feet underground into the concrete tomb of the Vorbunker. He was a broken and trembling shell of a man, suffering from Parkinson's disease and a total detachment from reality as he spent his final days moving non-existent armies on maps and accusing his most loyal subordinates like Göring and Himmler of betrayal. He issued a Nero decree ordering the destruction of Germany's own infrastructure because he believed that if the German people could not win the war, they did not deserve to survive the peace, and that the stronger nations of the East had proven their biological superiority. The city above him was a literal hell of fire and falling masonry as young boys and old men were thrown into the path of Soviet tanks in a futile and suicidal defense of a leader who had already abandoned them. On April 29th, he married his longtime companion, Eva Braun, in a surreal and macabre ceremony, and dictated his final political testament, in which he blamed the Jews for the very war he had started, and urged his successors to continue the struggle for racial purity until the end of time. On the afternoon of April 30th, 1945, as the Russian soldiers were only a few hundred yards away, Hitler committed suicide by a gunshot to the temple, while Eva Braun took cyanide, ensuring that his body was burned in the bunker's garden to prevent the world from witnessing his final humiliation. He left behind a continent in ruins, and tens of millions of dead, and a legacy of shame that would haunt the German nation for generations to come, as his GG or Twilight of the Gods ended not in a heroic blaze of glory, but in the stench of gasoline and the silence of a concrete cell. The man who had promised to lead his people to the stars had instead led them into the deepest abyss of human history, and as the red flag of the Soviet Union was raised over the ruins of the Reichstag, the shadow of the swastika finally dissolved into the smoke of a defeated and broken world. As the smoke clears over the shattered remains of the Reichstag, and the world begins to reckon with the staggering cost of a single man's madness, we conclude our 25-part journey into the darkest chapter of the human story. We have traced the path of a man who rose from the gutters of Vienna to the heights of absolute power, not through magic or destiny, but through the calculated manipulation of fear and the exploitation of a nation's deepest wounds. Adolf Hitler remains the ultimate warning that democracy is fragile, and that the veneer of civilization can be stripped away with terrifying speed when the people trade their conscience for the promise of a false messiah. His legacy is not found in the monuments he dreamed of building, but in the millions of empty chairs at dinner tables across the globe, and the scarred landscapes of a continent that had to be destroyed to be saved. The 1,000-year Reich lasted little more than a decade, yet it forced humanity to gaze into an abyss of depravity that we must never forget, lest we find ourselves walking that path once again. History is not just a record of the past, but a mirror held up to the present. And the story of Hitler's rise and fall serves as a permanent reminder that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance against those who would use the language of the people to destroy the rights of the individual. Thank you for joining us on this epic and difficult exploration here on history. If you value these deep dives into the forces that shaped our world, please like this video and subscribe to the channel, so that we can continue to preserve the truth of our shared past. For now, let the silence of these ruins be a teacher to us all as we look toward a future built on the lessons of the dark. This has been Historicon, where history meets the heart of the human experience.